Hi, Sheila.
Mic check, Madam Chair.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear
I can hear
you.
you. Yep, loud
Okay.
and clear.
And I can hear you, Counselor Flaherty. We'll get started shortly. I'm just confirming. All right, we're good to go. 5, 8. Okay. All right, we're just going to go ahead and start this working session. I'll do the opening statement. I'm going to introduce the counselors. And then the administration can go. I understand you have a presentation, Sheila, to go through. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
All right. You're good, Sheila? You can hear me? Sheila, can you hear me? I don't think she can hear me. Could Katie or Dominique, someone type her, let her know?
Yeah, I
She's
will.
connected. She's connected to audio now.
Aha!
Right now, yeah.
Can you hear us now, Sheila?
I was like, why doesn't this thing start?
All right. So, we're just going to formally start. My gavel and my water bottle. Whoops. Sorry. I got to get a gavel like Counselor Bach. Anyway, all right. So my name is Lydia Edwards. I'm the chair of the Housing Community Development Committee. Today is May 4th, Monday, May 4th, and it's 2 o'clock, and we are starting today's hearing, working order on 2 dockets, 0218, which was introduced by Counselor Flynn, was ways to discuss how to prevent displacement and eviction of tenants. And we combine that with the 0587, a docket that was introduced during the pandemic to discuss the housing rent relief program. So we had a hearing on both last month, and this is a follow-up working session to that. I am the sponsor of 058 and Counselor Flynn is of 0218. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 executive order modifying certain requirements for the opening meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, we will be conducting this working session via Zoom. This enables the City Council to continue to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations and also ensuring public health requirements. The public may watch this meeting via live stream on Zoom, and the public may watch it also at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email and will be made part of the record and available to all counselors. This is a working session, so there is not a requirement for public comment period, but we will have some, as some people have signed in, and they certainly have some questions. Before we continue, I wanted to let people know that we also have a Spanish Zoom channel, and if those folks would like to listen to this hearing live in Spanish and or re-listen to the recording later, that you can email Gabriela.coletta, GABRIELA.COLETTA @boston.gov. You can also find the Spanish link on our Facebook page. With that being said, I'm going to just do a quick brief, making sure I see Council Office join us. So I believe that I wanted to also introduce my fellow counselors. Besides myself and Councilor Flynn, we've been joined by Counselor at Large Michael Flaherty, City Council President Kim Janey, and co-chair of the Housing Committee, Counselor Bach. Am I missing any other counselors? Okay. With that being said, I will turn it over to Sheila Dillon, Chief of Housing, and she will introduce the other members of the administration here with her and start the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Counselor. Thank you for having this working session. So I am joined today, and I think I've got everybody. I'm looking at the top scroll here, but Katie Ford, Taylor Kane, Dominique Williams, Vielkas Gonzalez, and Tim Davis. I think that is the D&D team that is here. Hopefully I didn't miss anyone. Just to open it up and set a stage here, and then we're gonna give you a small presentation. You know, we before the rental moratorium, the eviction foreclosure moratorium was passed, the city of Boston felt great urgency about getting some resources on the street to pay for rent arrearage. So we went forward with a round of rent arrearage payments, and that round is underway, and we'll give you an update on the characteristics of that round and where we are with that. But we also heard from the city council and others that the process could be improved. We took that very, very seriously, and we worked really hard to improve the process for any future round that we may have. We've also been working hard to knowing that the city is not going to be able to come up with all the funds needed to help everyone. We've been working on many activities that have to do with displacement. And so we've been working with a coalition to increase the raft resources that the state is put forth. They put out 5 million. There is a coalition right now trying to increase that number to 50 million. So we're part of that and working on that. We really do need more state raft money. We're also working with our counterparts in our DC representation to get more federal CARES money for housing and housing displacement. We've been encouraging people through a whole host of ways to apply for unemployment if they can, recognizing that not everyone can. And then finally, really starting to work with our nonprofit, the owners of nonprofit and for-profit owners of affordable housing, working with them to find other ways to make sure that people who can't make their rent because of COVID-19 impacts are going to be okay. And that's looking at mortgage forbearance, looking at their operating reserves, looking at whether or not they can shift some of their expenses. So, and that's at a more portfolio-wide scale, because we're not, once again, we're not going to have all the resources that we need. So really looking at the larger owners of affordable housing and trying to figure out how they can get close to being whole without us having to fund those activities. So there's lots of work being done in this area, but I know that we're here today to talk about what the city can do with rent arrearage. So we'd like to give you a presentation on what was, and then talk a little bit about proposed improvements going forward. So I'm handing this over to Taylor Kane, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, and is it all right if I go ahead and share the screen so folks can see the presentation? There we go. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. Sorry, muted myself. So as Sheila said, we're gonna walk through a presentation that we put together that offers an overview of the round one process for the rental relief fund, shares some of our key learnings and reflections from that process, and presents how we're thinking about round two. And we're really looking to having a good conversation with this group. So as Sheila outlined, the rental relief fund was really created with these two goals in mind. We were really trying to fill a gap for folks who are not eligible to receive unemployment benefits or who have a job that means that they will receive insufficient unemployment benefits. So really trying to meet the needs of folks who are in some of the industries that have been hit hardest by COVID, particularly folks who are working in kind of gig industries and in tipped work. And as Sheila said, we really were trying to move quickly, getting resources out the door at a time when the state level protections were not yet in place, and really trying to prevent tenants from falling too far behind on rent and really meeting the present needs of this moment. So I'm going to start off by just going through the different phases of round one and reiterating that while we were trying to move as quickly as possible to really meet the urgency of this moment, we also really strive to balance this desire to move quickly with a desire to really create a process that was attentive to the needs and challenges that residents are facing in this moment, and also thinking about the partners that we're working with for the rental relief fund. So in round one of the fund, there were 5 different phases, from the pre-screening process and the release of the pre-screening form to the award of funds. The first 2 parts of the process, the pre-screening and lottery, were really held by our Office of Housing Stability and were intended to establish eligibility for the fund. For the lottery process, all residents who reported City of Boston zip codes on the pre-screening form were entered into the lottery. And we also created a pathway for folks who were determined to be ineligible, meaning that they had entered in a zip code on the pre-screening form that was outside of the City of Boston, to provide verifying materials, and that if verified were entered into the lottery process as well. So following the lottery, the Office of Housing Stability began referring applicants from the lottery to the vendors, NOAA and Metro Housing, for application processing. And so at that point in the process, the vendors sent the application form to the residents who had been referred to their caseloads. And then from there, after the vendors receive the different application materials, they're reviewing them, the provided documentation that residents are submitting, and then completing a calculation of need worksheet to determine the amount of rental assistance that would be awarded. And then following this process and determining eligibility and the amount of need, the vendors request a W-9 from the property owner or landlord. The property owner or landlord signs a form acknowledging that funds are going to be applied to a tenant's rent, and then the vendor will issue a payment. So that's kind of a step-by-step of what the process looked like for the first round. And this next slide just captures the pieces that I walked through, but positions them in time. So the fund was announced on Thursday, April 2nd. And the pre-screening form was then available in English and Spanish on April 6th, and then on April 7th in Cape Verdean Creole, Haitian Creole, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. During the first week, for the entire length that the pre-screening form was open, the Office of Housing Stability also had staff available to help folks complete the pre-screening form via phone. So really tried to provide a variety of ways in which folks could enter into the process. The pre-screening form closed on April 10th, and we also started to notify folks who had been determined to be ineligible based on the zip codes that they had inputted in the pre-screening form, and so notified them of that ineligibility. And then on Monday the 13th, we held and recorded the virtual lottery process, and then starting on April 16th, we began sending applicants from that first round of the lottery process to the vendors for application and eligibility verification. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Katie Ford to talk a bit about the different ways we interacted with residents and approached outreach for the first round of the fund.
Great, thank you, Taylor. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Katie Ford. I'm the operations manager for the Office of Housing Stability. And I just wanted to give a brief background. Our staff, we have 8 staff members at the Office of Housing Stability, and you'll see in a moment that we were operating at a pretty significant high level in order to meet a significant demand prior to COVID-19. For example, in 2019, we prevented 756 evictions. We were handling 100 walk-ins and 500 calls a month. 400 new cases each month. We hosted housing search and landlord tenant rights hearings in every neighborhood in Boston. And by the end of fiscal year 20, we will have provided $810,000 in financial assistance to folks that are facing housing instability. And similar to our other partners in government, the staff of OHS and D&D have been working around the clock to assist our constituents to not only meet the increased demand, but also to continue to manage their regular workloads, stabilizing housing for our most vulnerable constituents. For example, a tenant that had been working with OHS staff and Counselor Edwards' office for almost a year signed a new lease on May 1st. And we could not be more thrilled about that good news, because for our staff, housing stability is not just about financing, it's also about maintaining dignity and lifting people up. And so I wanted to report that good news to this group today. During the weeks of April 6th and 13th, our staff we were able to reallocate staff across D&D and BPDA, and we're so thankful for that. We were able to, as Taylor mentioned, help people fill out the pre-screening form over the phone. We were making phone calls to constituents that didn't have email addresses so we could update them about the lottery process and if there was any changes or amendments to that process. We were also having staff respond to people's residency verifications. We also utilized the language line to make sure constituents who use languages other than English were spoken to and informed about the process. And we also had multiple staff reviewing thousands of emails from constituents and responding to those emails with resources. So if you want to go to the next slide, Taylor. Thanks. This is the OHS statistics monthly. So we were already at a pretty high volume. We were going at a nice clip. You can see the calls kind of increased and the cases increased in January, February, March. There was a slow uptick once businesses started closing down and people started realizing they weren't going to be able to make their April rent. Obviously, the April 2nd was the date that the fund was announced. So you can see that there was just a big spike in calls, and I'm pleased to say that, you know, no one was left without a call back or an email back. So that's the OHS picture of what we were dealing with and what we were able to deal with in the month of April. And those calls continue to come in at that same volume. So if you go to the next slide, Taylor, sorry. As you may have seen on your own social media channels, we began publicizing the Rental Relief Fund on social media April 3rd. We had a high level of engagement on these platforms, and we were able to send out information about the fund through the City of Boston's text message alert system, as well as participate in discussions with community groups. And you can also see below that the Rental Relief Fund was covered heavily by local media, including in multiple languages. And I'll give it back to Taylor.
Great, thank you, Katie. So as everyone on this call knows, there was a great deal of interest in the initial round of the Rental Relief Fund. And we, as we're thinking about kind of next rounds, want to understand who reached out in the initial round and understand the level of need that was expressed in the folks that were in the first round of the fund. So on April 13th, we had over 5,500 Bostonians who were entered into the lottery. And the analysis that's on this screen really highlights how the different residents who were entered into the lottery process closely align with the populations we had hoped this fund would support. These numbers are based on the responses that residents reported on the pre-screening form, and I think begin to give us a picture of our renter landscape, at least from the month of April in Boston. So based on the responses that we saw on the pre-screening form for the folks that were entered into the lottery, 86% had reported some loss of income or job due to COVID-19. 50% said that they were not eligible for unemployment. 68% said that they did not receive any type of rental subsidy. 56% had not been able to pay 76 to 100% of their monthly rent, and 40% had a post-COVID income that was less than their rent. So in addition to kind of understanding this high-level picture of the folks who were entered into the first lottery, we also wanted to understand the geographic distribution of the need that was expressed by those who completed screening forms. So as y'all can see from this visualization, residents from across the city completed screening forms, and you will notice a high number of submissions from neighborhoods like East Boston, Dorchester, and Roxbury. So when we compare this map with the applications that are currently being processed, which is this map right here, we can see that there is a similar geographic distribution as we saw from the pre-screening forms in terms of the neighborhoods where applications are currently being processed by our vendors. So after we closed the first round of the fund, and the pre-screening form, we wanted to provide a way for residents to continue to express their interest in the fund. And so as of May 1st, we had as of May 1st, these are the responses that we have to the expression of interest form that is currently available on the Rental Relief Fund webpage in 6 different languages. And those forms have over 2,000 responses, which is really a sign of the continued need of support from residents. So while round 1 is still, there's Kat. While round 1 is still ongoing, we have spent a great deal of time reflecting on the process and identifying opportunities for growth and modification in the second round. Again, we're really trying to find this balance between meeting urgent needs with a thoughtful and grounded approach. That is really one of our guiding goals for this. So for round 2, we're just going to walk through the kind of 7 different areas where we're planning additional enhancements or making modifications from round 1. And these areas have been identified through conversation and reflection, and we're really looking forward to discussing these different areas of growth with you. So the first area that's on the screen is around the timeline and ensuring that residents have access to relevant and important information in a timely manner. We plan to announce the reopening of the fund 4 days before the pre-screening form goes live. And in this announcement, we also plan to include information about the closing date for the screening process and the lottery date in that announcement. And in the same time period, we'll also be sending out notifications via email and phone to all of those who submitted expression of interest forms. The second area where we will be making some enhancements or modifications involves our outreach plan and ensuring that we are working with a network of actors to get the word out about the second round. This is, again, something that we plan to begin 4 days prior to the next round, and we will look to other city departments like the Office of Neighborhood Services and the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, as well as the City Council, to help connect with groups and organizations in different neighborhoods to make sure that folks know that the next round is happening and what they need to have together in order to complete the screening form. For the outreach process, we will also, again, text households who had signed up for City of Boston COVID alerts, and we'll publicize through our social media channels as well as through ethnic news media outlets. Apologies again, there's going to be another cat that comes on the screen soon. But the third area of concern, the third area that we will be making modifications to is the pre-screening period and ensuring that residents have sufficient time to both hear about and complete the pre-screening form. We plan to extend the length of time that the screening form is open for to include a weekend. And we also will continue to support residents who need assistance completing the form via phone. The fourth area that we will be making changes to involves the lottery process, of which there are 2 components. So there is the lottery prioritization component, where we'll use a similar process as we did for the first round, where we will be prioritizing households who are not eligible for unemployment benefits or who are not able to report all of their pre-COVID earnings for the unemployment calculation. And then following the lottery process, we will again be reaching out to all residents who were entered into the lottery with their lottery rank, with their application number. And in this next round, we will also plan to share information about other resources and relevant policy changes that relate to housing that would be helpful for all applicants to know about. The fifth area that we're planning on making some changes to involves program eligibility. As with the first round, we are continuing to focus on households who are at or below 80% of area median income and who have been economically impacted by COVID-19. Additionally, we plan to prioritize households who are not receiving a housing voucher or in subsidized housing. As Sheila mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, we are working on portfolio-wide solutions for these households and want to aid households who do not have an ability to recertify their income. The sixth area involves the application process. So for this, one of the learnings that we really had from the first round is that we want to give folks greater flexibility when it comes to the documentation that they need to provide as part of the application process. So we've added some additional options for folks to complete signed self-certifications for pre and post-COVID income, as well as a form to complete notification of no income post-COVID. And the final area where we're exploring some changes in growth relates to tenant protections. So for the second round, we're planning to have a landlord commit to notifying the Office of Housing Stability about any changes in tenancy and sign a pledge to work with a mediator through the Office of Housing Stability. For all of these areas of growth that I've just mentioned, we've been in touch with staff from other cities who are similarly exploring or have already launched similar types of rental relief programs. And we have greatly benefited from the insights of the staff from other municipalities that they've been able to offer, as we are all finding ways of meeting the needs of this moment. So this slide just captures kind of in time, again, the different pieces that we just walked through. So the process for the next round, we are proposing begin with this outreach period from day 1 to 4, then transition into the release of the pre-screening forms available in the 6 different languages for 1 week, including a weekend. After the forms are open for a full week, we will close them on day 11 and then conduct the lottery on day 12. So the last area that we wanted to share some of our thinking around relates to monitoring and tracking involved in the Rental Relief Fund. So we plan to continue looking to the application form as a way to track the different types of landlords and property owners who are receiving payments through the fund. We also want to pay attention to roommate or room renting situations. We currently have a process for checking that in this current round of the fund, whether applicants are part of the same household or renting rooms. And we plan to make a modification to our application form for folks to identify if they are renting a room in a building. So lastly, in addition to continuing to prioritize households that are not eligible for unemployment benefits, we really want to focus on households who do not have access to other types of rental assistance. The Rental Relief Fund, I think we can really think about it as part of a broader set of solutions and interventions to ensure housing stability for Bostonians. And we are really trying to think holistically about the resources that we have and focusing on different areas of need. To this end, as we mentioned earlier, we will continue to work with property owners around portfolio level solutions and explore different strategies to supporting the many households who are experiencing vulnerability in this moment. So thank you again for holding this space to have this really important conversation. And we welcome your questions and collaboration as we move forward with this next iteration of the fund. There we go.
Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Yes, Sheila, I too forget to unmute myself. I saw that little happy dance. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick roll call in case I missed any of the other counselors that joined us later. Again, we have Counselor Flynn, Counselor Flaherty, Counselor Janey, Counselor Bach, Counselor Braden, Counselor Mejia, and Counselor Sabi George. Have we been joined by any other counselors that I did not mention? Okay.
Councillor Arroyo was trying to get on the Zoom. He
Councillor
didn't have
Arroyo.
it.
Fine, I sent him the link.
Good.
Okay, I will just put him down with an asterisk, expecting him to join us. All right, very well. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think it was very thorough and breakdown of before, during, and after, and the timelines. I thought that was extremely helpful. I'm going to just go right into some questions because it is now 2:30, and I had a good record of trying to finish everything in 2 hours, so I'm going to do my best to move us along. My first question is, in the second round, how much money do you expect to give out?
I don't know exactly. It's going to be, we're still waiting to see how all of the federal funds, what we're going to get exactly and what we're going to be using for different activities. I would say it will be at least at what we put out before, if not more, but I don't have an exact amount right now. I can get back to you soon though.
Right, so with the NHT committed about $5 million. And I do know that the CDBG money came out with $10 million and that was supposed to go to the rent relief and to small business. So could we get the number before, and not just in the press release when it comes out, could we actually get the number before of how much is going to go out?
Yes.
The other thing I had a quick question about is, so how many people ultimately were eligible and sent contact information for the vendors?
698 were deemed, well, so for the vendors sent out applications to the first 698 ranked. Now, since people are being deemed ineligible, we're continuing to go through that list. So they have the top 800 ranked and they're working through that on a rolling basis.
So just sieve it down for me. We had 5,500 people in Boston apply. And then at the next step was to actually send to those who qualified through OHS the actual contact information of the vendors. How many people got that?
800.
800. And that was kind of what the expected amount was, right? For
assuming that they all maxed out at 4,000, yes.
Yes. And then from there, 698, what was that gap? How did that get sieved out? There's 102 or so.
So that was the initial, if they all maxed out at 4,000, and then as we started weeding people out, we just added people to the list so they can be going through the application process on a rolling basis. We were giving people deadlines to respond, and if they don't respond after 3 or 4 touches, then we have to move on. They're not going to be removed from the rank, but they're going to, they're going to be deprioritized.
So how many people actually turned in applications to the vendors?
Oh, right now?
Mm-hmm.
Hang on. Sorry. The people who have turned applications back in is 276 have been received back.
And from there, that 276, we funded how many?
So far, 181 have been deemed eligible.
And now we're waiting for them to get their contact or their income information, their W-9s and their all that other stuff back.
Yeah,
to the
various forms of contact, yeah.
So what's the average amount that's been funded?
So right now, Metro is estimating the average amount will be $3,750.
And how many people have actually gotten that amount or any amount?
Any amount, not a lot right now. So there's six households have received amounts, but through this week, they anticipated sending out an additional round of funding.
And that would be to the 181.
Right.
Okay. And those who were in that overall bubble of 800, there still could be some, maybe another check with them to see that they apply, that they turn the application in?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what we're working with right now. You also allowed for people who didn't get into that 800 or didn't apply to express interest. You have a list of 2,000 households.
Yes, that's the amount that's completed the expression of interest form.
Have you bothered to screen into them at all? Or are you just going to hold off on them until you get through this 800 or this, and complete this entire process?
Yeah, so the 800 is coming from the 5,000 number that was entered into the lottery process. And so the expression of interest folks, we would next reach out to them when we reopen the fund for a second round. But we haven't done any screening to see eligibility, because eligibility for the first round or the pre-screening process is really around City of Boston resident.
So in the next round, and I do appreciate, one, you adding a weekend, and two, allowing for, we've been joined by Councilor O'Malley, by the way. I I appreciate that you've seen that the timing is everything, right? And people to adjust, to get their things in, and adding a weekend, I think, is vital for folks. So I appreciate that. I'm seeing about, overall, you said it'd be about 12 days, right? Before they're even put into the lottery to go through the other processes
Yes.
to get the application,
Yes. Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
So is that what the vendors are telling? If we elongate that process to 12 days, is that allowing us to push more money out faster? Because we're doing a little bit more pre-screening and cultivating and getting that done. I'm wondering, I mean, because it's, if it announced on the 6th, and we have 6 households now who've gotten some funds, right? And when do you think they got those funds?
So they received those funds on Friday. And then I think maybe on the 30th, on Thursday. So the total
Okay.
funds out through Friday were $17,353.
If I could add, I think we are surprised that more, the application is not that onerous. The
Mhm.
documentation, we're going to simplify round 2, but it still, as things go, it's not that onerous. We are a little surprised that people aren't getting their applications in more quickly. We thought the nonprofit vendors would be overwhelmed, and we haven't seen that. So we are looking at that and trying to simplify, but it's curious.
I actually wanted to talk on that, because it seems like, whether intended or not, we've also been joined by Counselor Campbell. It seems that it ended up being another form of screening people out by adding another thing for them to do, right? So my initial thought is I applied for it, right? And I'm part of being screened and being assessed, but maybe many people were not, or whether they would actually be just given contact information for them to submit another application directly to a vendor. So it's 2 steps. So maybe that's why they assumed, oh, I already did this, or I'm not sure, I've already done this. So there might be confusion. In reality, to get in line, you have 2 points of applications: one to express interest, the second to actually, once you've been through that and you're confirmed actually viable, right, as an applicant, because folks from Chelsea, Revere were also in that line, you had to remove them. Then they have to wait for the contact information to apply again. And that's where it seems like you lost 102 people, from 800 of the big to 102 people, and then to 276. So I'm wondering if that, if in the next round, you would consider steps to getting it and adding that step in there so people see it in the FAQ or see it in your applications or online. There are 2 things you must do. It's 1, pass this, 2, pass this, and then you're in line. But I would have assumed I've already applied. And this is, again, I do appreciate that everyone's learning as we go along. I do appreciate the pressure that is on your shoulders. So I hope you don't see this as this is a wrong thing or not. Just a suggestion to advertise that step.
Right.
So people know you're not finished.
Counselor, we've been working, we talk like every day with the vendors on what we can do to streamline the process more for constituents. There were some technological gaps for some folks, so they've been working on that. Some people needed to receive the application by mail, so we've also been trying to figure that piece out too. Sometimes landlords are getting back to them slower, which is another reason why more money hasn't gone out. So we're definitely working with our vendors every single day to streamline that process, because they know that our goal and their goal is to get the money out as quickly as possible.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Counselor Flynn, followed by Counselor Flaherty. One, I appreciate the 2 things you did to bring landlords to some sort of accountability for some landlords. So they don't take the money and then wait for the eviction moratorium to be over with and kick the folks out. Or at least there's a check, like they took this money, they've got to come back to you to say and I assume the changes include an increase in rent, or if they're going to get rid of the tenants, they have to notify OHS. I think that's good. I'd prefer if it was just commitment not to do either. But I understood from our last conversation about this, if it was too onerous, there might be some landlords who would actually would prefer not to get the check. So I hope that there's still pushing for how we can get that. And I also appreciate the requirement for mediation. That I think is huge. And I know we've tried to get that through other legislation. So I do appreciate that certainly, so that they won't be moving anyway, anytime fast. So I appreciate those two things. I'll leave the rest for a second go around. We will go through counselors. We're going to go to the advocates right after, before we do a second round with the counselors, to make sure, because I see a lot of folks have signed on. So with that, Counselor Flynn, followed by Counselor Flaherty, then Counselor Janey. Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you to Sheila and your team for the work you're doing, especially during this difficult time. Thank you for the cooperation that you've given to my constituents and to my office on these issues, as I've had people being displaced, and your office has been very helpful. So I want to say thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards, for continuing this important conversation about how to help our renters during this pandemic. I know that there are many residents who need assistance in paying their rent during this critical time, and we need to do whatever we can to help them. I especially don't want to see seniors be evicted. I don't want to see persons with disabilities be evicted. And I don't want to see immigrants be evicted either. It's an important conversation to have, and I think we need to do everything we can to stand with our tenants. So the question I had was, people that work in restaurants, they may not traditionally have a paycheck, or maybe that paycheck hasn't, with the restaurant closed, maybe their accounting system hasn't caught up with them yet, and they're having a difficult time applying for assistance so that they can pay their bills. What are we doing for, and a lot of them are immigrants, what are we doing for these renters that are having a difficult time paying their bills, but also not having the right paperwork so that they can go through the process of getting assistance?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something that we have been spending a lot of time thinking about and making changes to address that specific group. So we've included as an option, if folks aren't able to have access to pay stubs, that they can submit a letter explaining their situation in terms of what they were receiving in terms of income. And we also have a signed self-certification document where folks can outline, we've created a template for that, where folks can outline what their pre-COVID and post-COVID income would be.
Thank you, Taylor. And so over the summer, or maybe even into the fall, as things slowly get back to somewhat normal, what I don't want to see is landlords that have big apartment buildings, taking advantage of the system because they've been hurt financially, but taking advantage of the system to evict people that even have been paying all along, or jacking up the rent so high that a person with disabilities or a senior just can't afford it. Are we also considering that possibility as the summer passes and into the fall, that landlords that own a lot of property might take advantage of the situation?
I think it's a really good question. And I, welcome any ideas on this. It's, we work with landlords daily to try to cajole them and force them into doing the right thing. But, if someone's lease is up and they want to raise the rent, they can, and those are very painful situations to see and participate in. What we try to do in those situations is try to get someone out of the situation they're in and to either negotiate with the landlord for more time or get them into something they can afford. But without more legislation and more, teeth, that's all we can do. you know, when we really did give thought, and we talked to a lot of cities and a lot of, both in Massachusetts and nationally, about tenant protections associated with these resources that we're talking about today. And nobody's putting any requirements on them because they're really concerned that a landlord for $3,700 isn't going to agree to any tenant to agree for tenant protections. And so we're really worried that tenants that could be harmed. So it's not a great answer to your question, and I'm hopeful that the market slows down some, and that we get, you know, landlords that are again interested in having good tenants stay. But all we can do right now is request and try to relocate whenever possible.
When I filed my hearing order back in January to start the conversation on ways to provide longer eviction notice periods to tenants following property transfers, my proposal was based on using Boston's condo conversion ordinance as a roadmap. I stated that in one of the most difficult rental markets in our country, would like to see long-term residents of Boston who have been here, say, longer than 5 years, receive a 1-year notice following a property transfer, while other seniors, low-income residents, persons with disabilities receive 2-year notices following property transfers. Or generally speaking, if you are going to raise the rent or evict somebody, give them proper notice. And I'm saying proper notice, maybe 2 years notice before you're able to evict them, maybe 3 years notice, but just to give some senior citizen 30 days or 60 days and tell them, hey, by the way, you're up next month and you're on your own. I think that period of time should be much, much longer. And I'm talking a couple of years anyway.
I
Councillor
couldn't
Flynn,
agree with you
before you
more.
answer, Sheila, before
Sorry.
you answer, Councillor Flynn, that was 5 minutes. So if after Sheila responds, do you mind if we?
Sure.
Thank you.
No, I couldn't agree with you more about longer notices. There's a lot of pain when buildings change hands, and I'd have to go back and look at what you had filed, Counselor. Let me go back and look. It sounds like it might need state legislation, but that's not something, I mean, it shouldn't shy us away from at least, you know, reviewing that and seeing what can be done. So I look forward to talking to you more about that.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. And to Councillor Flynn, we do still get to negotiate the condo ordinance. Actually, we're all in conversation about that. So there are additional protections we can still put in. That is for us to negotiate and increase. So we still have work to do on that. And I look forward to that hearing in your voice, Councillor Flynn.
All right. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and just want to shout out to Sheila and her team and folks that are on the phone for the work that you've all been doing in response to our COVID-19, particularly as it pertains to some of our most vulnerable residents and those that potentially facing eviction. So want to make sure that this program in particularly and the next round, we want to make sure that it's going to people who need it the most and struggling the most. I know that this COVID-19 has impacted people in many different ways. For some folks, they haven't missed a beat financially, and for others, it's devastating. So making sure that the safeguards are there and the outreach is there to make sure that we're getting to our most needy residents would be, and which is, I think, I know Chief Dillon and I have talked about this as those efforts are underway. So I commend those efforts and want to also just put on your radar, it's what I mentioned last week on the council call with the mayors, that our colleges and universities are now starting to try to figure out how they can move forward. And I know that our schools locally, you know, we're home to over 150,000 students. And there's going to be some question mark as to whether or not our students are able to participate in the international exchange program. Are we going to be getting students from abroad? Are American students being able to go overseas? And I know of many instances where families are in the process of potentially signing leases. June 1st start date. So I know a lot of folks work on the September 1st, but there are some folks, particularly in parts of the city, that our host communities to a lot of our schools. And so my concern with respect to our colleges and universities is that in the event that they're making decisions to move forward and prepare for their fall semester, I want to make sure that we don't lose more of our rental housing stock in whatever efforts they're doing. So for example, say that there are, 500 students who initially in one particular school, or maybe even 1,000 students at one particular school that initially were going to go abroad for their fall semester. They've now canceled that because of COVID-19 and personal reasons. Those students now either need to find housing on campus, but those lotteries have already taken place on campus housing. They're going to be forced potentially to look off campus, and that's going to put an additional strain on our neighborhood rental housing at a time when folks may be struggling to pay rent, and we may see an uptick potentially in some eviction activity. So just want to comment on that, maybe get some of your feedback. And at the end of the day, I think it's important that we listen to the activists and to the advocates, in which case, Madam Chair, that's going to be it for me for questions. I'd just like to listen to what folks are saying and how we can be helpful as a council to them. So thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Chief Dillon, and for others that are on this phone and for the work that you're doing. We started out making daily decisions to hourly decisions. You guys are now making decisions literally by the minute, and appreciate the effort. So much so that we're being recognized by some of our counterparts in abutting communities, and they're looking to Boston and implementing some of the things that we've done. I know Chief Dillon and I are aware of a couple communities where they've done that. So appreciate it, Madam Chair, and look forward to getting a response. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Councilor Flaherty. So Councilor Janey, then Councilor Bach, then Councilor Braden. And unless you had any quick response, we can just go on.
I was just going to say really quick, Councilor Flaherty, that you're right. I mean, people are in dire straits out there, and we received over 2,000 calls last month, and we've at least been able to connect all the people who called us to other resources, such as the food at boston.gov resource, every resource we can think of. It's really just heartbreaking when you're on the phone with folks. I know that your staff also has those same calls that they take where, you have to ask them, do you have food? And the answer a lot of the times is no. And so, I do appreciate that everyone here appreciates that, because I know that you all are also dealing with the same types of calls.
Thank you. Councilor Janey?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking you and Councilor Flynn for your leadership in bringing these important conversations forward. And I want to thank the administration for all their work. I'll just ask a couple of questions and pause and hear a response, and then wait for the next round. I'm wondering, Chief Dillon, if you could just maybe talk about what the scope of the problem is. I know even though there was a lot of demand for rental assistance, I'm assuming that there's an undercount here and that there are many others that need support. So I'm wondering if we have a clear number of what the impact of folks around COVID in terms of needing assistance. As we think about folks who may need assistance, I'm wondering if how many small landlords are counting on short-term rentals. So I don't know if they're probably not getting covered in this because they probably have to advocate to their mortgage lender, but I just wonder that there may be a significant number of folks who are maybe elderly, their kids are out of the house, that they count on short-term rental that may not be available to them. Please excuse me, my home phone is ringing. Hold on. Then the other question is, I wonder if there was a breakdown around the types of landlords who were able to get assistance from their tenants. So are we talking about the small landlord with the triple decker? Are we talking about other types of landlords? And then finally, there's a slide in the slide deck that talks about the 5,200 Bostonians who entered into the lottery. And I wonder if there's a breakdown by income. So you talk about who was either eligible for unemployment, people who had lost income, but there's no clear breakdown of who these folks are. So what incomes they fall into, what neighborhoods, what racial ethnic groups they fall into. So just wondering about that. I know that there was the pre-screening forms in the next neighborhood in the next slide, but in the slide that kind of breaks down the 86%, the 50%, 68%, I'm just wondering if there are breakdowns around income and racial data. And then finally, Taylor, I'm wondering what the cat's name is. And then I'll wait for the next round for the rest of my questions.
And the kitty's name. You could start with that one, Taylor.
Well, I have two cats. Their names are Aretha and Franklin. I love them dearly.
Oh, I love that.
Good
I
names.
absolutely love that. Thank you for that. I'm so glad I asked the question.
That's great. Now is a priceless moment. So if I could, Madam President, if I could have Tim Davis is on the call. We did work with MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and looked at who's going to be most impacted. Everybody's impacted with COVID-19, but of the renters in Boston, who we thought was going to be most at risk. Tim, can you summarize that for us, please?
Certainly, this is Tim Davis. So we worked with MAPC on an initial analysis. Obviously, a very, very high percentage of Boston tenants are likely to be unemployed and or have some kind of financial impact because of COVID-19. We quickly found out for those tenants, for a very, very high percentage, the unemployment assistance plus the additional $600 per week allowed under unemployment through the end of July will make sure that those families are whole and are able to pay their rent. So that left us with really trying to figure out the demand from parts of our community that there is very little data. And that is both on undocumented workers and workers who are paid primarily in cash or partially in cash, such as tipped workers. And all we have through some work kind of discovered that there are probably around 18,000 undocumented workers in Boston, of which as of, we revise this number every week when we get the unemployment numbers, because we have some idea of the concentration of those people in certain job occupations, that there's at least 3,900. I think that's an underestimate. The 3,900 out of the 18,000 are already unemployed. And those would be kind of our world of our undocumented workers. How many households that is? That may be 2,000 households that have some economic impact from that. In addition, it's actually harder for us to even figure out how many workers are paid primarily in cash or are tipped. But the unemployment rate amongst the unemployment rate for those in the restaurant field is, over 40%.
I guess I'm sorry. I'm
that's very
looking for more
significant.
specifics around the breakdown of where this money actually went.
Right, I think you have, I understand that, Councilor Janey. That your first question was about general demand.
Yes.
I think you had further questions about the clientele who are actually in the lottery pool, so that for that, I will turn it back over to Taylor to help answer those questions.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you, Tim.
Yeah, and great question. So in terms of the pieces around the breakdown of income, neighborhoods, and then race and ethnicity, for the breakdown by income, that's certainly data that we can pull together based on some of the responses to the pre-screening form. I think that we can work on pulling that together. And then in the slides that we shared, we did the breakdown by neighborhoods high level, but I think we can kind of explore if we're layering on the income piece with the kind of geographic spread of responses that we saw from the screening form that we can explore. For the race and ethnicity piece, that's not something that we asked in the pre-screening form, but it is part of the application process. So I think that piece, in addition to the breakdown around different types of landlords, those are pieces that we'll have a better understanding of once we have more of the application forms in.
I think that would really be helpful. And I'm hoping that this information will inform the next round. Certainly, we know that there's a huge demand. Certainly the district councils, we're all hearing from our constituents, and it's important that we make sure that this money is getting to those who need it most. So I really appreciate it. I can wait for the next round. Would be interested in hearing more of the lessons from the
Mhm.
first round, how it will inform. I know there were lots of starts around language access. And so I'd really love to hear highlighted. We learned this, we didn't get this right. Here's how we're fixing it in the next round. So as more counselors ask questions and as you share the plan for the next round, you could really crystallize those pieces. That would be helpful to me. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll wait for the next round.
Thank you very much. And so we're also taking notes to make sure we follow up with a set of questions. It's Counselor Bach, followed by Counselor Braden, then Counselor Mejia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the whole team for presenting on this. I also found the presentation really helpful. I had a couple of questions. One was just to a little bit better understand. I see that we're thinking in the lottery for the second round to prioritize folks who, are at or below 80% AMI with a preference for 50% or less and not receiving a housing voucher. I guess what I'm trying to understand is there a reason we can't just limit like when we do the pre-screening intake, that we can't just have the people who we send to the vendors be people who meet those criteria plus being Boston residents and not I guess I don't really understand why we don't make a little bit tighter of a cut up at the top and then be able to more efficiently kind of push those people through knowing that they're the target people. Because I think, well, obviously what we're getting, a lot of council questions are getting at are, we really want to know who are those 800 people, and there's 600 of them who are a mystery to you and to us to some extent, right? Because we pushed a lot of that initial info gathering, I guess, further back in the process, and then we're not getting the uptake from people. So I'm just wondering how you've thought through the moment, what to do in pre-screening versus what to do with the vendors and how to cut that list down.
So just briefly, what we're thinking about with the two-part of the application, this pre-screen and the application part, why we don't think we can just combine that right now at this moment for the next round, is that if we're combining the app and the screener, we'd be asking so much of people up front who might not end up getting selected. And given all the other technology barriers that we've seen with having the fund or the screener being online, I think that was our main thinking around that is just too much information and people aren't giving accurate information. Some people they actually type in too many zeros for their income and things like that. So I feel like that would really end up maybe eliminating people who would have qualified. And that was I think our big fear around it, but I'll let Taylor continue off of that if you have anything to add.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we have been thinking about as well. And so right now we're really trying to lay out what are the pieces of information that we're currently getting in the pre-screening form, what are we currently getting in the application, and where is there potential opportunity to pull some of those questions to the screening process. But to Katie's point, we don't want to make it the pre-screening process too onerous for folks that then ultimately they find out they aren't eligible and they've given lots of information. So trying to strike a balance, but definitely seeing an opportunity to thinking about kind of what we're asking at those different touch points.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It doesn't seem to me like you would want to get to the business of document uploading or anything like that, but it does seem to me like it feels like there's really 4 or 5 things that we're using to define the category of people we really want to get this money, that aren't getting it from the other sources. And it just feels like IDing those people a little more efficiently earlier on, because it also helps us know like if we're going to have people chasing people with multiple follow-up calls, you want them to be spending that effort on the people who were most worried about not getting the resources, right? And then my follow-up question on that is, I wonder, I think there's definitely a concern with undocumented folks about fear and how that affects their engagement in this process. And I sort of have 2 questions on that front. So one is there any evidence to suggest that some of the people we're not getting follow-up from in the 800, the missing 600 are disproportionately undocumented folks? Certainly it seems like a tell without knowing anything might be whether, clearly the applicants were disproportionately from East Boston. If the people coming back to us are not disproportionately from East Boston, that might suggest something. It's all just correlative, right? But So I guess wondering if we think we're losing people there out of fear and maybe, you know, not knowing about the vendors and like, where's this info going? And so wondering how much of a sense we have on that front. And then also just wanted to raise up something that I think you guys have heard from other quarters, but I've certainly heard loudly from a number of advocates, like a lot of concern about the security of even just people's initial pre-screening personal data. And concerns just about the fact that like Google has a sort of history of answering federal subpoenas when they get asked, and we're not asking people for super specific information, but we are asking people for enough, and our intentions vis-a-vis this program are public enough that somebody who was really trying, you know, might come after that in, you know, a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever. And so I saw in the presentation that you're adding like, you know, having some more phone assistance for people filling out the form and pre-screening. And I wondered if there's a possibility for you all to kind of have an off-ramp that lets people who don't feel comfortable filling out the form call in and have their answers recorded, not into the Google Doc. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like just into a Excel or just like a list held by the city. I just think the specific question, there's two questions. One is about whether the city would ever get subpoenaed for this information, but the city could make its own choices about that. The other is whether whether Google, you know, and I know it sounds paranoid, but I know a number of other operations where people are trying to help undocumented folks have been very concerned about data for this reason. So those are my two questions on that, is just both the Google Docs issue and then whether you think the drop off in people replying to the applicants has anything to do with immigration status.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, one reason we didn't want to grab or take a lot of information in at a government level was for that reason, and that thinking that households might be more comfortable with a nonprofit, NOAA being in East Boston and kind of trusted. So that was, I think that's another reason why we didn't want to, you know, take a lot of personal information, income, that kind of employer, any of that kind of stuff in the beginning. Any suggestions you have? We don't want to scare anyone away, certainly. We're asking for so little, but still people might not be hesitant about giving it. People could call in, it could be taken over the phone, but still it's being taken over the phone by the City of Boston worker initially, the initial information. So, any suggestions on how not to have anyone go or leave because of fear is most welcome.
Thank you, Councilor Bach.
I was just going to say really quick, the undocumented piece, the issue that we're having with undocumented people responding to the application isn't, some of it was fear at first, I think, to actually apply for the funds initially, but the folks who have actually been screened into the lottery and selected in the top rank that we had sent over to the vendors, their issues mainly surrounded around proving their pre-COVID income. So that was something that we worked with the vendors on, and that's why we came up with the affidavit.
As we, sorry to interrupt, but as we go on to the advocates, many of whom work with this population, I'm sure they're going to have incredible ideas about how to build that bridge, as they already are doing that in the community right now. So with that.
Yeah. All right, I'm done. But I'll ask Chief Dillon a question another time, just about how, what we're.
We'll have a second round, Councilor Bach, if necessary. I have questions piling up too, but to allow for now, Councilor Braden, and then Councilor Mejia, then Councilor Asabi George.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for a very thorough presentation. I want to echo Councillor Bach's concerns about the undocumented. I wonder if the whole issue of public charge is coming into this situation as well. Down the road, if folks are undocumented and then they go to apply, if they're in their process of green card holders or whatever, will this be held against them going forward? That's the only concern I have.
Excellent question. We do have some attorneys from GBLS who may be able to help with that in the advocate. I don't know if you guys have any questions or any answers to public charge.
Sorry, Councilor Braden, thank you for the question. I just wanted to let you know that Mass Law Reform had written us and let us, we have a document. It says the Boston Rental Relief Fund is not a public benefit under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's public charge. And we plan to post that more clearly in the second round. And and obviously in multiple languages. And we're going to make sure that people know that, because that's definitely not the intention of what this fund is. It's the exact opposite, actually, to scare undocumented people away.
Excellent.
Thank you. That's all for now. In the interest of time, I'd like to hear from the advocates going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia, Councillor Sabi George, and Councillor Arroyo.
Hi.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Chairwoman Edwards. So just really quick, thank you, Sheila and your team, for all your hard work around this. We really do appreciate it. I'm just going to keep my questions very specific and brief. So, you know, I think you already know this, Sheila. I mentioned this to you before. It's that I am an exponential learner. So I went ahead and filled out the application just to see what it looked like. And I got an email response stating that I was put on the wait list for this rental relief fund. Unfortunately, what I found to be a little bit alarming is that I entered information that I shouldn't have even made it past this initial screening, which is what the email stated, that I had made it past the initial screening, and that I was going to be entered to the lottery. But my name on the form was test form. And just some of the information that I used was just a little bit kind of like over the top, that I shouldn't even made it past that screening phase. So I'm just a little bit concerned about that, just in general. And then I did get an email stating, and the email was in English only, stating that I was going to be put on the wait list. But I didn't receive another follow-up meeting another follow-up email about any other opportunities or resources that I can get. And the reason why I went through the process myself is because I wanted to really feel what it was like as a person who would be in need to go through this process. And so I just think that there's some things that we may need to work out a little bit, so that when we do this again, that we fix those little technical pieces. And I think that all communication, as much as possible, should go on multiple languages regardless, because you just never know what people are able to read. Just something just for food of thought here. So here's some questions. Is one of the issues that we've come across, and this is specifically around lack of access to language, is support for residents who don't speak English. Residents who don't speak English could dial in by phone to complete the form. But I guess how many people use that option? I'm just curious. How many people applied in languages other than English? And the reason why I asked that question specifically is because I know that the way that this application was rolled out was that there was a delay. And I am going to hope that the next time around that that everything is rolled out in multiple languages from the onset. The other question that I have is the state level moratorium on evictions lasts 45 days beyond the day the COVID-19, the state of emergency was lifted. If the state of emergency is extended and the eviction moratorium isn't, what plans are in place to address tenants facing eviction during that time? I'm curious, before the eviction moratorium, evictions in Boston could occur in as little as 14 days of non-payment. Just wondering, how is this number of days determined and what is the goal? The other question is, people in Boston have been experiencing housing insecurity since before COVID-19. This is an opportunity for us to have a solution-oriented approach to how we address housing in Boston. And so I guess, what is the plan to continue this conversation and continue to hold ourselves accountable to residents facing housing insecurity after this public health crisis is over? Because what I'm seeing is that you're seeing an uptick on the number of people who are, well, we hope to see an uptick of people who are accessing these funds. And, I just think that anxiety is going to be, heightened thereafter. So I just kind of wanted to think about, what's your plan and what that looks like. And then I'm curious, in terms, I know we've asked for information in regards to the landlords that were applying and reaping these benefits. I'm just curious in terms of, if you have any racial breakdown in terms of and I guess not so much racial. I'm curious as like I'm a homeowner. I know Councilor Edwards is a homeowner. I'm just trying to make sure that in terms of equity, that smaller landlords are able to are also able to take advantage of this, and that we're not just focusing all of our.
I'm sorry, can you just clarify? Are you asking for a racial breakdown of the landlords or the tenants?
No,
Okay.
I know we're not supposed to do that. That's why I was like, well, let me tell you what I'm trying to get at, Katie, and then maybe you could figure out what information is appropriate. I'm really concerned about that the landlords who have access and resources and have more than X amount of units will be the ones that are communicating this to their tenants in terms of communication, in terms of just like letting people know about this relief fund. I'm just curious about that. And I don't know if maybe that's an appropriate question here, but I just want to know who's benefiting from this the most, aside from the people who need the rental assistance. I just want to make sure that these big corporate landlords are not the ones who are the ones that we're who are taking the most advantage of this, I guess, if you will. And then my last question is around, I know you talked about folks who are undocumented. I know there are a lot of people who are living in, households right now where everyone is undocumented, and not everyone is connected to the internet, and not everyone is connected to a nonprofit organization. There are a lot of people who are underground, if you will. So I'm just curious in terms of outreach, aside from your traditional working with nonprofit groups, what else are we doing to reach our most vulnerable?
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. We're gonna turn it over.
So I think I'm going to have to look to other members of the team. So, we gave a lot of thought to who benefits from this, and the money, it's not a large amount of money. And we really did want to subtract any landlord who could find another way. And so we are doing that with the affordable housing portfolio, because we feel like, one, they have the resources, we can work with them, we know who they are, but we were concerned about saying that tenants in small buildings could get resources, but tenants in larger buildings couldn't, because in the end, it's the tenants that get harmed. We don't have any legal authority to say to landlords of larger buildings, hey, you got to find a way for these folks. So we didn't want any tenant harmed. So we didn't specify any building size associated with the relief. We laid out our best thinking on an outreach plan, but certainly if there's other things that we should be thinking of, other organizations, other ways to get at people that, that don't read local papers, or that you don't have reach to, et cetera, we really will be willing to expand that. We did our best thinking on it, but really very, very open to ideas. Trying to think what else there was.
I believe Councilor Mejia had asked about how many people had used the helpline for language access.
Do you have that?
Oh, use a language line? No, we actually don't get that report till the end. We should be getting it soon. We conference in a translator, so they send us a report at the end of the month. We should get that soon.
We can get that to you.
I did just want to say briefly.
By language as well, Katie?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can see if they can give me that report. They should be able to. I think they bill us that way, so shouldn't be a problem. In addition, all the information, that's all good information to track that Councilor Mejia was mentioning, and just want to reiterate that we did this really quickly the first time around, and that's why we're here learning, because we're trying to get more best practices on how to address these issues. I did just want to correct one thing. You can't get evicted in 14 days in Massachusetts. I just want everyone who's listening or watching this to know that only a judge can evict you. So if you do get one of those letters from your landlords, that is not an eviction. You need to call us or call legal aid.
The one thing that I think Councilor Mejia, before we turn it over to Councilor Sabi George, and then Councilor Arroyo, then Councilor O'Malley, was the ask of what preparations are you guys doing now to expect when we all expect a deluge of massive amounts of evictions after this moratorium is over. I assume that there has to be some preparatory work, and I just wanted to make sure I uplifted that question, Councilor Mejia. I apologize if I've didn't say it correctly. And then after that answer, we'll go to Councilor Asabi George.
No, we are, so we are looking at that, and it is scary. So the idea is to get this resource out, to get a lot more raft, as I mentioned. We're hearing that there may be more CARES Act for this resource, and then working with every landlord that we have relationships with on how they're going to solve for this other than, additional public funding. But when the moratorium, we got to start planning now for when the moratorium is due, because you saw the spike in calls, and I'm heartened to hear that, and many of you are involved in. Can we get right to counsel? Call it a pilot, call it a whatever you want, but can we get that in place? What a great motivation for all of us to get that in place, when the moratorium lifts. So I think we should all be, fighting for that as well. So I think it's not going to be one thing. I think it's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 things.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is definitely what keeps everyone at OHS up at night. And I know on the council and everyone on this call, we are tracking the data on cases that have been filed prior that were rescheduled because of COVID to make sure that those folks aren't immediately issued an execution. I mean, we're doing everything we can to work with all the organizations and collaborate on a plan, because we're all going to have to act swiftly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And Councilor George, do you mind if I because there was a question that I asked that was not answered, and maybe I can do it in the next go around, but I'm really concerned about the communication for folks who did not make the first round. And, I just think that there was a lot of discrepancies there. So I'm just really intrigued as to why I didn't even
Sure. So I can tell you why you were screened in. You were screened in because you had a Boston zip code. We weren't tracking the names or anything like that. It was just strictly Boston zip code. That's why you were originally screened into the lottery. Again, we don't want to try and make people ineligible because they made a mistake typing in their name on the form. Obviously, test form isn't obvious, not your name, but and I do appreciate that you did that.
No, but I guess my concern really is the fact it was the follow-up after it was that I was waitlisted, but then there was no other communication in terms of here's where you can go, here's some resources, here's the next step. And then everything was in English. So I'm just really pushing for the next go around for communication to be multilingual, and that for people to get the resources that they need if they weren't able to be approved this time around, so that people don't feel hopeless. I just feel like, that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you. So we will, we're now going to go to Councilor Asabi George, who's been waiting patiently. Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. After Councilor Asabi George, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor O'Malley, and then Councilor Campbell. That'll be the finished round, and then we will turn to the advocates.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you everyone for being here today and for your continued work. I especially want to thank Katie Ford and Kathy Miranda from OHS. They are regular participants in our family shelter roundtable that happens regularly, and we had a conversation this morning, and working to make sure that our families are able to get housed. I wonder through, as we look at the data, and I understand that it may not be able to happen in the immediate, but I'm really interested in how many true homeless aversions we've done. Like, are we able to avoid true homelessness? And for me, that's really important. And then to see a breakdown between individuals or families with children in those households, who are we supporting through this effort? And in the grand scheme of things, it's important to me, but the immediate work is to make sure families remain and individuals across our city remained housed. So, but to me, that's interesting work, and numbers that I think that we should be focused on, at least on the secondary level. So I don't know if there's anything to share now around some of the work that's happened to either help families remain housed so they don't become homeless, or perhaps if there's a number that we can look at for families that have been homeless in the past and are now again significantly unstable in their housing. And I also do want to thank the Chief Dillon, for her commitment and her department's work around doing some sort of family housing surge light, because we do, families that are experiencing housing loss or instability or homelessness, if the sooner we can house them, those shelter spots become open for other families that are experiencing homelessness. So that's my bit, and I do look forward to the testimony and commentary from the advocates. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. If you want to briefly respond to Councillor Sabi George, and then we can go to Councillor Arroyo.
I guess I'm asking staff a question too. On the application or in the round 2, could we track family composition? How many children?
So we have a household question on there. We have to have every household member listed because we need their income information as well.
Okay.
So that's all on there.
Okay.
And if I could just add a request, if you're going to track the children and maybe the age, also where they attend school, because school is that missing link. And I know the conversation with the shelter providers in the state system and the city system misses that piece, but with the schools piece. So being able to have them at just as much information as we can collect is better for us for the near term and the long term. So thank you very much for that. And Taylor, I really like that vigorous head shaking. So it's good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Arroyo, followed by Councillor O'Malley, then Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm aware the advocates have been waiting for a while, so I'll make these very brief so we can get to them. And then I'll come back on the second round. Thank you, everybody on the call, for the work you do. So my first question is, when it switched over to a lottery, my major concern with that was a lottery system by definition means it's at random. And for me, as a district councilor, it matters how and where that aid is going, whether or not there's a concentration in that aid in very specific neighborhoods. Is there any breakdown? And I know that not much of that aid has been released, it sounded like, yet. But is there any awareness or data as to where the concentration of these awards are going?
Before you speak, I just note that I understand there's some staff conflicts, and Sheila may have to leave. I apologize, I didn't catch that email earlier, Sheila. So if it's okay with you, Councillor Arroyo, I would love for you to bang out your questions, and then I want to just check with Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Campbell if they have any questions for Sheila, and then we'll go back to you, if that's okay.
And I'm sorry about that. Longstanding commitment.
Sure. And so I guess I'll bang out my 2 questions now, and then you don't have to come back to me. So that first one was just, is there any data on what neighborhoods are getting this aid? The second part of that is in terms of, because there's going to be equity issues if it's first come, first served. There's going to be equity issues if it's a lottery. Does getting this reward now keep you from getting a reward on a lottery-based system on the second round?
Okay, so those are the 2 questions from Councillor Arroyo.
And then I'll come back around. That's it for me on this one.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the brevity. I just wanted to make sure everyone at least got to ask Sheila Dillon some questions. Councillor O'Malley, did you have any quick questions for Sheila Dillon? You may have stepped away. Councillor Campbell, did you have any quick questions for Sheila Dillon?
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you, Chief Dillon, for all your tremendous work.
No? Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you go ahead and answer the questions for Councillor Arroyo, and then we'll be turning it over to the advocates. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say you had questions?
Not for Chief Dillon. I can actually ask it of her team and just let her go, given her time restrictions.
Excellent.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, feel free to answer, Sheila, then we'll go back to Andrea.
Yeah, so I would just, so the lottery one, I'm going to defer to others on the thinking. It was a lot of back and forth on that. But we don't have any data yet on the successful applicants, or who is actually going to get the resources, who's gotten the resource. It's too early and the numbers are too small. But the applications, they are in the PowerPoint. Where are all the 5,500 eligible applicants came from. And we're pretty pleased to see it was across the city, but we will, as soon as we know who actually ends up getting the resource, we can make that data available.
And Councilor Rohr, if I may, on the $4,000 question right now, the rule is $4,000 max for a 12-month period, and that's supposed to cover up to 3 months of rent. So I did actually speak to a constituent yesterday, and they were thrilled to find out that it wasn't just covering their April rent, that it would also cover their May rent, which was due on Friday.
Okay. Okay. So we've gone through the, we're going back to Councilor Campbell, excuse me, for any questions she has for the team. And then we're going right into the advocates. Thus far, I've heard from through hand raising and through messaging that Lauren Song and Jade would like to testify. So if advocates want to testify or ask questions, if you could please raise your hand so I can make a list going forward while Councilor Campbell's continuing her questioning.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, for your leadership, not just of the committee, but also on these issues. And thank you to Councilor Flynn as well for his sponsorship on this. I'll be really quick to save my time, or to give my time to the advocates. Most of my questions had to do with documentation and process, that public charge issue. So thank you, Katie, for addressing that in the breakdowns in terms of the data, which Councilor Janey got at. So I appreciate that. I guess my one question, and it's a little bit connected, but not quite, I guess, but I think this is a good platform to ask it. In addition to obviously rental assistance and our residents reaching out to us in terms of that need, what's also coming up, and this is the same population of people, of course, is those folks who on the public health side are testing positive for COVID-19 or showing symptoms and then having to, of course, go home. Many of my folks are essential workers. And finding it difficult to quarantine, obviously, at home, given their household demographics. So I'm curious what the office is doing, not only on the financial assistance piece, but this is the same population dealing with this health piece. If there's any sort of collaboration or conversation or connection around how we help those folks who are also not only dealing with the rental assistance piece, but the public health concerns as well. And thank you, Katie, Taylor, and Chief Dillon, and your team, of course, for all the incredible work you guys are doing.
Thank you for that question, Councilor Campbell. I just want to say that we're working with Boston Hope. We also are working with the Boston Public Health Commission. We get calls all the time from people who are dealing with either their first responders, or they've been tested positive and their landlord is trying to discriminate them and kick them out of their house for testing positive. I mean, we've been dealing with these issues all along ever since the first positive test was done. And we're definitely working with all those agencies. I saw an email from Kathy on our staff about Northeastern's housing folks. We've been working with single room occupants. We've been working with a lot of folks trying to figure this out. We've been working with Jim Green at D&D. In our division, who's really is at a rapid clip, helping people get into individual shelter. And Vielcas Gonzalez on our team is working on families getting into shelter. And it's really tough at these times because normally pre-COVID, we would tell folks, if you don't have a place to stay tonight, try going to the emergency room first. And now we can't send them there. So we're having all those issues that we've had to really just brainstorm around and try and be resourceful with the groups we've been working with have been fantastic. And if there's anyone that your staff receives a call from, please send them our way and we'll try and help them out.
I appreciate that. And my last question, which connects to that, is if there's a list of places where people can go where these concerns are coming up. Obviously the universities absolutely need to step up. Some are doing better than others. We've had some youth, for example, that are homeless, and some universities have said no to housing them, right? Small numbers. So be curious what universities, the hotels and others doing to temporarily house these folks who are testing positive, can prove that, right, in some way, and that their household, they can't quarantine in their home. So if there's a list, that would be helpful. I know if the convention center, these places that are coming online can serve that support, but also I want to be helpful, right? I think there's tremendous advocacy that the council can bear based on the calls we're getting or concerns we're getting, or even some employers, right, who are trying to help out. So any way we can be helpful, or I can be helpful from this side, please do let me know. Thank you, and thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you to the advocates.
I'm happy to forward that information to your office and to anyone else here who would like that.
Thank you.
If you could just make it part of, you can send it to Christine O'Donnell and it becomes part of the record and all of us get a copy. Katie, thank you.
Okay.
So now we are going to turn over to our advocates. As I mentioned before, I had asked folks to raise their hand, or not their physical hands, I can't see, but if you click on in Zoom, you can raise your hand that way. You can also chat to me directly, and I'll be able to see if you are wanting to speak. But for now, I'm going to go and turn it over to Lauren Song, followed by Jade, and then I have Carolyn Cho. Lauren?
Thank you, Counselor. If you don't mind me letting Jade go first, I know that she has another commitment that she has to get off on, if that's all right with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, Councilor Edwards, as well as the rest of the council members. My name is Jade Brown. I'm an attorney in the housing unit at Greater Boston Legal Services. I'm here on behalf of our low-income clients to talk about their housing challenges stemming from COVID-19 and the need for allocation of funds towards housing stabilization. Many of our clients applied for the first round of rental assistance funds provided by the city, and we applaud the city for making those funds available. However, many more low-income clients are still desperately in need of rental assistance. One of my clients, Maria, is in her 50s and works as a grocery store worker. She has a chronic medical condition. She's a tenant and she shares a 3-bedroom house with her elderly landlord, who's a Spanish speaker. Maria was forced to stop working due to COVID-19. She applied for the funds from the city of Boston as soon as they became available, and waited anxiously to hear back. Maria did not want her landlord to think she was taking advantage of her, but she was unable to pay the rent and was worried about being able to buy necessities like food. When she heard back from the city, it was not good news. So many people had applied for the funds that she would have to wait to see if she was selected from a lottery. She's still waiting for that assistance and has not heard any additional update. There's a critical need for rental assistance and housing stabilization funds for residents like Maria. There are many residents who are still waiting for unemployment assistance, and many more who may not qualify because of things like their immigration status. The city has issued a 5-day public notice announcing how it plans to use the CARE Act supplemental funds. If the city adopts its current proposal of designated $5 million of that money to be used for small businesses without any provision for rental assistance, the city will miss the mark in terms of addressing the most pressing and critical need for Boston residents. We ask the council to urge the city to set aside as much money as possible to meet the immediate needs of many Boston residents who are facing housing destabilization as a result of COVID-19. The recommendations for specific priorities are as follows. We ask that the city set aside funds that tenants can use to pay for and can use to pay rent to their landlord. Provide at least 3 months of rental assistance. Require landlords receiving the funds to agree not to move tenants out or evict them for COVID-19 related arrears, and to set aside funds for long-term housing solution. In regards to our clients who are dealing with the shelter system, we ask that the city take action to reduce the density in congregate shelters, and also set aside ESG funds to be used for universal COVID-19 testing in family shelters in Boston. So far, the universal testing that has been done has been primarily in single adult shelters, not family shelters. And there's a need for repeated testing because, as we know, people's status can change as the pandemic progresses. We're also asking for the assistance to homeless services agencies to include the ability for those agencies to fund more permanent housing, not just to provide hotel rooms, which is a limited assistance that will eventually run out and result in folks not being able to have more permanent housing. We also ask that there be recognized that at this stage, there are many domestic violence survivors who, because of the lockdown, are forced to remain in dangerous situations. And DV shelters have traditionally been congregate, which is now dangerous due to the spread of the pandemic. Although some agencies are placing survivors in hotel rooms, once the economy opens up, these hotel rooms will no longer be available. And so these survivors could really need vouchers or other temporary rent assistance to find places to live. And to my last point, although the recent eviction moratorium law prevents landlords from being able to file eviction cases during the state of emergency, the rent continues to accrue for many tenants. And when the state of emergency ends, Massachusetts will face a tidal wave of eviction cases for non-payment of rent. Unless meaningful and substantive protections are enabled by legislative bodies, there will be a significant statewide need for rental assistance. Rental assistance right now could be the difference between a family being able to hang on long enough to regain employment and catch up on bills, and a family that is several $1,000s in debt when the economy reopens. Based on my experience working with tenants, once low-income families fall behind by more than a few months, it is extremely difficult for them to catch up on rent payments. It becomes even more so difficult once the landlord files an eviction case and adds on court fees, costs, and possibly attorney's fees. The city now has an opportunity to take preventative measures to ensure that more Boston residents do not become homeless as a result of COVID-19. And we urge the city to take those measures. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Excellent suggestions. And I think it echoes a lot of the concerns we've also voiced. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Song and then Carolyn Chow. And again, if anyone else wants to testify or has questions, could you please raise your hand in the application or through chat, contact me. Lauren?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards and Flynn and other members of the City Council. My name is Lauren Song, and I'm an attorney with Greater Boston Legal Services. And on behalf of the Right to the City Coalition, who I believe are on the call today, and its organizational members, Alternatives for Community and Environment, Boston Workers Alliance, the Chinese Progressive Association, City Life Vida Urbana, New England United for Justice, and Neighbors United for a Better East Boston. I thank you for hosting this working session on a city rental assistance program and the opportunity to present some testimony. The Right to the City Coalition Boston is a grassroots organization, base building organization that's representing low income, people of color, immigrant communities working together for social justice. Since the pandemic, we at Greater Boston Legal Services have been working at the national level with the Housing Justice Network and at the state level with CHAPA and MLRI to understand the mechanisms to structure housing payment assistance programs with an explicit eye toward equity, and also how to fund them most effectively using the CARES Act funding through the HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, CPD programs, which include the Community Development Block Grant, which you've been hearing about, CDBG, as well as the Emergency Solutions Grant, ESG, and Housing Options for Persons with AIDS, or HOPE programs. These are collectively what we call the CPD, Community Planning and Development Program grants through the HUD's office. These special CARES funds are required to be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus pandemic. While they have been traditionally used on an annual basis by the city and for specific uses with specific vendors, due to the federal waiver, there are many more creative ways that these funds can now be allocated. Admittedly, there are some pitfalls associated with restrictions in terms of double dipping, and as some of you guys have already heard, and questions about with regard to immigration status, that we can more explicitly make clear and provide technical assistance on, that it would not be a bar or a public charge issue, and how to structure them in such a way as to avoid such issues. And we would love the opportunity to work with the city in terms of furthering the creative use of these CARES funds. The pandemic has affected everybody, but not everyone has been affected equally. Unsurprisingly, the groups who have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and its ripple effects are the same groups that have long struggled against systemic inequality. These include low-income households, communities of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and the elderly, and people with access issues due to limited English proficiency, literacy, and other issues. Even with the state RAFT program for rental assistance that Sheila Dillon mentioned, the city knows all too well that there will be many, many households who fall through the cracks and will need the city's assistance. For sure, the city must prioritize allocation of limited resources to address the most urgent needs of the city's most vulnerable residents. And toward this end, we are urging the city council to prioritize and urge the city to prioritize allocation of all the city's CARES funds, the federal CARES funds, to fighting the virus by ensuring that all people, low-income immigrants, disabled, elderly, and the homeless, have a home that they can shelter in. I will note that the D&D administers the CARES funds for all of the city, not just for the housing programs. And today marks the last day of a 5-day public comment period. It's 5 days because the notice and public comment period has been waived to make it much shorter. And this is for the city's second amendment to its 2019-20 action plan for use of the HUD CARES funds. This is for $10.9 million of the HUD CARES funds through the CDBG, ESG, and HOPA programs that I just mentioned earlier. And today is the last day for public comments on it. And I was personally very puzzled to see that none of the CARES funds, none of these 10.9 millions were proposed for the city's housing payment assistance program. Specifically, I'm sorry, I've just lost my place. Let me just see if I can. Specifically, the 5 million of the CDBG fund that's being used for this particular amendment is allocated for the Small Business Association programs. And another 5 million of the ESG funds is for services for the homeless. In other words, the overhead costs associated with serving the homeless, which is just as valid as anything else. And about 450,000 is for the HIV/AIDS service providers under the HOPA program. And while there's an additional 5 million in CDBG funds that have not been programmed or allocated and is not part of this amendment process and subject to the notice period that ends today, the first amendment to the plan, which was in early April and which completely escaped my notice, it flew by in the 5 days, didn't catch it until mid-April, was also entirely allocating to the SBA program, the CDBG funds. The CDBG funds proposed here will allow the city's state SBA program to reopen and continue offering its grants, but there is no money set aside for housing payment assistance programs. This is very troubling to me. In particular, because when you consider that all nationally, the total amount of money that all the states got and localities got for housing related services was $12 billion under the CARES Act. This is not all allocated yet. This is supposed to come in waves, but it's $12 billion total. And if you compare that to the total of thousands of billions that have been directed nationally to non-housing programs, and this includes $370 billion for the federal SBA program, as well as an additional $359 billion for the prior program for SBA also under the CARES Act itself. It's obvious that the housing in terms of a priority is just enormously dwarfed by consideration for other programs at the federal level. And what is disturbing to me is to see this happening at the city level with regard to its allocation, proposed allocation of its CARES resources. The city had a very bold start to very big national recognition, actually, for starting maybe the first city rental relief program that you've just been hearing about, allocating 3 million of the city's own funds to help the most vulnerable of the city's residents that our OHA's friends have been updating us on today. There's really no program like OHS in the United States. It's fantastic, no doubt about that, and kudos to them. The OHS Rental Relief Fund program focuses its limited funds to low-income residents, regardless of immigration status, who are at risk of losing their rental housing and who do not have access to expanded or regular unemployment benefits, or face significant reduction in actual income despite unemployment benefits. So notwithstanding some of the hiccups that we have heard about, it is really actually doing a fantastic job in terms of trying to prioritize and protect people who would not otherwise be protected or provide any resources from the federal funds. But today, the city continues to face a pandemic that's killing thousands that we can't control. Massachusetts' death roll today was over 4,000, with a total of 68,000 confirmed cases. And the same day, Boston reported yesterday 426 deaths total and 9,929 confirmed cases. The public health crisis is not going away, and it's aggravated by the city's decades-long housing affordability crisis. More than ever before, it's imperative that the city commits to a housing first policy. The magnitude of the pandemic is such that even if we allocated all of the city's federal CARES funds toward a housing payment assistance program, it would not be enough. We recognize that the city has competing budget demands, but being timid now and failing to prioritize a strong housing solution would be a grave mistake. For sure, the economic consequences of COVID-19 dwarfs the city's budget in severity. Indeed, it strains all of the 50 states and the nation's budgets and in mind-boggling ways. But until the virus is under control, it will still be futile to debate whether the city's economic outlook is good or not, let alone talk about their long-term budget shortfalls or where the priorities need to be. We can't fix the economy until the virus is first under control. And for that, everyone needs a home to shelter in place. The only way out and to have a future economy to even debate is to adopt a bold housing first policy. The case for prioritizing a housing payment assistance payment program, excuse me one second, is very strong. In April, almost 1/3 of households nationally said they couldn't pay the rent. May 1st is the second month when rent will be due since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of renters will again have to choose between paying their rent and buying food. This is not a drill. We're not talking, we call clients and the OHS has been talking about, yes, they screen for food need. People are struggling to decide whether they pay rent or they're gonna have food on the table for their kids. In fact, it's really devastating. We have a lot of elderly people who are living in our public housing who don't get the food lunches, for example, who are really hungry and they don't have the resources to pick up their prescriptions. I mean, the devastation is just really, really of such a proportion that it's unfathomable. While I sit here in my safety and I know that people are struggling out there, it's very difficult not to urge the city to really prioritize the housing needs and other needs. In fact, even before the pandemic, too many of the city's residents were struggling to pay rent. And I know all the members of the city council are very familiar with that and committed to that issue. According to the MAPC, which Sheila Dillon mentioned, in the first wave of unemployment applications in the week ending March 21st, just among Boston renter households, this is a study that was commissioned by the city, there were 10,900 who applied for unemployment insurance. The national unemployment filings are astronomical. The pandemic has created an unprecedented need for rental assistance in a variety of forms. The National Housing Low-Income Coalition, of which we're a member, estimates that the need for housing payment assistance will be in the $100 billion range. We clearly need the city to draw on all available reserves and general funds and to direct the federal CARES funds to go toward housing stabilization. The HUD regulations are clear that the CDBG, ESG, HOPWA, and other CPD funds can all be used for housing payment assistance. We just have to be a little bit clear about it, trickier to navigate the regulations, but it can be done. And we've got the legal resources to support that. When the state's housing and foreclosure moratorium expires, as Jade mentioned, we will be facing an unprecedented tsunami of urgent housing assistance needs. It's not enough to say, well, you'll have lawyers who are going to be doing this. We lawyers can't do much if the money isn't there. We will need to be prepared to weather the storm together. And we will need to be prepared with a very strong and well-funded city rental housing assistance payment program. As we collectively stand against this catastrophic public health crisis the city is facing, we urge the city council to ensure that the city is directing as much of the federal CARES funds as it possibly can to prioritizing housing stabilization for especially vulnerable populations who have almost limited or no other resources and must turn to the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I want to first say to the legal services attorneys, I have to acknowledge that you are a certain kind of frontline worker. You are there in crisis moments before there's actually pandemics. And so I want to acknowledge that I was a legal services attorney. The secondhand PTSD is real, and I cannot imagine the trenches, what you guys are doing and what you're dealing and facing with at levels that are are astronomical. So I have depended on you guys throughout this, asked for your advice throughout this. So many of us are going back to you guys. The organizations that you mentioned that you represent are probably a tip of the iceberg of the amount of people whose voices that you just amplified today. So I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Councilor Edwards, if I may, can I just say really quick, GBLS.
No, you can't. I'm gonna, sorry.
That's all I want to say.
Sorry, 1 second, Katie. I want to make sure that we're clear. We were discussing deadlines and timing around specific grants and how we might not qualify or need to qualify for that. Tim, you actually testified on those grants recently in the CDBG money and what was approved. Could you address what was discussed, if the deadline's today, and could you just address that?
Right. I want to thank both Jade and Lauren for your comments and your thoughts. And I want to say that we are certainly looking at housing as really a really important priority in this effort. First and foremost, we're looking at health as the most important thing. And obviously, as part of that, homelessness, the ability for families to be able to shelter in place, the ability for people to have shelter, to be densifying shelters is part of that health question. So that's one way in which housing has been really brought to us as a very important issue during this crisis. And so in terms of funding, we are certainly looking at ways that we can fund housing and housing stability, both the short-term needs around homelessness, the short-term needs for families who can't access the enhanced unemployment insurance. And also we're looking towards that day, just as you have raised as an important, very important moment for us, when the eviction moratorium ends and we have families who still are not financially capable of paying their rent, even if they did get the unemployment insurance. So in terms of our kind of medium-term planning, that's very important for us. I did want to, however, really actually correct some information that you brought out about the CDBG and the other HUD funds. In the first substantial amendment, which was issued in April, that was solely about business funding because we had already decided to do the first round of this rental relief program from other non-federal sources. And so those were funds that were, the First Amendment was about reprogramming some funds from previous CDBG funds, not from the CARES Act funding. For the 10+ million in the CDBG funds, we have actually not released a substantial amendment yet for those funds. We are anticipating that it will be a mix of both additional small business funds and rental relief funds. And so the deadline for that is not, there has not been a deadline for that. And so we do not have that document out and available yet. We also wanted to actually wait before we made some final decisions about that funding for this call today, because we thought it was important to hear from you and from the counselors before we actually released that. And so that's very important to hear that you think that's important. And I would say that I agree that the housing funds are very important. It also should be known for the public that the CDBG funds are limited to paying for 3 months of rent. However, we have other sources of funding, and you mentioned that, the emergency shelter grant money and also HOPWA money can be used for some longer tenant assistance. The ESG money, we are going to be, if we haven't already done it now, we will be publishing it in a matter of hours, our plan for the first round of the ESG funds. And that is because we are going to be doing an RFP for people working with folks who have experienced homelessness to come to us with expenses that they probably have already incurred. So a lot of these expenses are related really to the public health issues, but we will be getting additional ESG funding and additional CDBG funding that we can then sit down and take a longer look to see what is the priority for now and what is the funds that we can keep aside to help those families who may have a need in August or September, when the other kind of more immediate solutions we've already taken care of the more immediate needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren, if I know you may want to respond, but I did want to give Carolyn Chow, who's been waiting patiently. She's the last person to speak and have a comment. Do you mind if we turn to Carolyn, let her ask
No,
her questions,
that's
and then feel free, and then we're going to go back for a second round for any other counselors, okay? Thank you so much, Lauren. Carolyn, thank you for waiting so patiently.
Thanks, Councilor Edwards, and thanks to you and to Councilor Flynn for having this. And yeah, I'll be really quick. I mean, just, obviously want to echo everything Lauren and Jade said and what we're all seeing on the ground and the importance of housing, short-term and medium-term and long-term, as you were talking about, Tim. I think the one just thing I wanted to raise specifically, I've been thinking similar to how Councilor Mejia has around just access to the funds. So obviously, there's been a lot of work around language access and a lot more to do. And then also really thinking about how to make sure undocumented folks and folks most vulnerable feel comfortable and safe applying. So here we are live on YouTube, but I will raise that Google, we don't know what Google does with our data. And that's a real fear for all of us, and particularly for folks who are undocumented, to be filling out Google Forms with their information and for us to authentically be able to guarantee their safety. So I don't have any quick solutions to offer in a minute here, but I would say that Bethany Lee, who's the director of the Asian Outreach Unit at Greater Boston Legal Service, and I have been talking about this for the Asian Community Relief Fund and some other work we're doing, and are happy to be in touch with D&D, but just really want to emphasize both to make sure folks actually fill it out and feel safe, and then also for the actual reason that we don't know where the federal government will target, and that once it's in Google, we actually as a city don't own the data, Google does. So just raising that as both a concern for making sure folks feel safe accessing, and a concern on the back end with potential legal issues in the future. So yeah, just would love to be in more conversation with folks around that, and yeah, just continuing to really emphasize that we need to figure out the ways to make this as accessible as possible to all of our folks, especially, immigrants, non-English speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I think for our follow-up, which we do send a list of questions to the administration, what we could do is have IT direct, maybe respond, our IT department respond directly to security concerns, and how that relationship does or does not work, or what the contracts are with Google while we use them as a platform. I do know on my cell phone, for example, I have a different security. The city of Boston puts a different security in my work Google account, which is different from that. And that's as technical as I'm going to get right now, because that's all I've got for you.
Yeah.
But I am committing to getting you a response. And I think it was also raised by Councilor Bach as well.
Yeah.
Councilor, we have our D&D IT director on the call if you want her to respond. Her name's Susanna.
Yeah, hi, it's Susanna. I'm the IT director for D&D. The whole city has an enterprise contract with Google, and that's through the Department of Innovation and Technology, so the central IT department, and I can talk to their director of operations to get the specifics, but usually we have, unless there was something specific to that agreement, we have a standard terms and conditions that we have going for most of the contracts we have that includes an agreement not to share data, et cetera. So I can look into that and find exactly what the terms are for our enterprise contract with Google. But the central IT department always includes something like this in their contracts.
And then, yeah, just in addition, would just suggest that on the front end for actual people filling out, that we figure out how to, make that clear in non-technical language. Because as someone using it, like Councilor Mejia said, when you fill it out, I mean, it just looks like any other Google form that one might be filling out online. And there's some stuff on the first pages that makes it seem unclear if it's eligible for undocumented folks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So before we go to the second round, Lauren Song, I don't know if you wanted to respond at all to Tim's comments about us. It looks like we're still going to be doing an amendment, Tim.
Yes, we still have to do an amendment on an initial $10 million. That's correct.
Okay, good. Okay,
So
Lauren.
the public notice for that amendment is out, and it says on the notice that it is closing today. It's subject to a 5-day notice period, and today is a deadline for it.
Yeah, I have been discussing this in the background with our staff. I do not know how you received that information because we thought about pushing something out last week. And then we decided not to because we didn't feel like we were ready and we had enough kind of forward motion on where we were on the rental side. And so I do not know how you received that. And we have actually, there is no comment period open at this moment.
So that's very helpful, but I guess that begs the question, which is basically, it would be very helpful to know in advance, especially with a working session like this, to see how, in fact, the planning is going forward, because we're talking about significant funds and there's, additional rounds potentially, but that's up to HUD to some extent in terms of how they allocate that, and to be able to have a role in terms of directing where the priorities might be for the city, which is in line with what the community would like to see.
Yes, I understand. And we didn't put it out exactly because we didn't know what we were doing yet, and we wanted to wait for this session. And on future funding, we would also have to do some kind of a substantial amendment for additional funding as well.
Thank you. And we'll continue this conversation, Lauren. You should shoot me maybe whatever that language is or particular concern over to my, my government address, and we can continue this conversation offline. I'm really particularly interested in seeing that and hoping we get this resolved. My understanding when we discussed this during the working session for that particular money was that it was absolutely going to go to both rent relief and small business relief. You know me, I've been looking at even CPA funds to try and get additional money for rent relief programs. So there's no doubt in our mind that we need to pull back, assess every last dime to go into housing. And I think that that's a commitment you have from me and my colleagues to do that. And thank you again. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. We're going to go through, and I didn't see any other hands from advocates, so I'm going to go back to the counselors to ask some final questions. I had just one question. Katie or Taylor, could we think of a program in which you're working directly with not just nonprofit, NOAA and Metro, but if outreach and the bridge building is something that we need to get done, is there any way to help fund or to locate yourselves or some, work with City Life to be there with the applications and funds? They have weekly meetings, well, maybe not so much, but on Zoom. Is there any way to work with, not to put it on you, GBLS, but other legal services places they can be not vetting for you, but be there as a point of outreach? The forms could be there for them to hand to their clients that qualify based off of you just saying you need a Boston zip code, you need something, but there's other forms of outreach and points of contact that we have. The organizations that Lauren represents today, CPA, City Life, Nube, the ACE, all of them have points of contacts and networks and emails that they can target in a special way, and they're trusted. I don't know if there's any prohibition to working with local churches because of government money and religion. Maybe that's something, a box we cannot open, but I do know several very good churches that have large followings that would also be able to be in partnership with you.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think for the outreach component, it would be great to work with all of the different organizations you mentioned in terms of ensuring that we're getting the word out to folks and leveraging networks that people already trust. I think that makes a lot of sense. So we can touch base about the right points of contact for each of those groups. And we've been thinking about kind of what's the packet of materials that's most helpful to have at the beginning of the process when we're planning to announce the fund, that folks can kind of have a bundle of materials on the front end.
Thank you. So I think that's wonderful, and I look forward to that packet. And don't forget, even checking in with those groups about how the packet could look and how it's easily read and whether it's accessible. They're experts in community organizing that, it's a untapped resource, and we should just tap as much as possible to get these resources out.
Counselor, I just want to say really quick, we're also working with the Boston Public Schools HERN liaisons as well. So we are working with other organizations. We're happy to work with all of them. And I just also want to say what I was trying to say earlier, which is that GBLA, you all are absolute heroes. I wish people would stand on their steps and clap for you every night. You're absolutely amazing. You're our partner in this fight, and it's not over. So buckle up.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Is there any way you can tell me how much you expect? So 800 was for the first round. Do you expect another 800 for the second round, or are we going to go bigger?
Well, like Chief Dillon said, she's hoping that it will be equal or more funds. So hopefully it will be more than 800 folks that we help. Absolutely.
Okay. That's it for me. I'm going to check in with other folks. I don't know if Councillor Flynn, a lot of folks had texted me and I wasn't able to check on everybody. Councillor Flynn may have already gone. Okay. Councillor Flaherty, I think he had to go earlier. Councillor Janey may have, yep, and Breeden. Councillor Mejia, she may have had to go.
Here, can you hear me? I'm still
here.
here.
Yes, Councillor Mejia, second round.
Yeah, no, I'm glad, Councillor Edwards, that you uplifted all the organizations in terms of the outreach. That's exactly where I was getting at in terms of these non-traditional spaces. I think we always refer to the usual suspects, and I think there are a lot of organizations who are doing this work every single day. So I'm glad to hear you list them all. And then I also would like to make an extra little push that maybe we can figure out a way, how do we engage small local convenience stores and places where our people are still shopping. Maybe if you even put a flyer in some of these spaces in different languages, because I think there might be still some folks who are falling through the cracks who don't engage in any kind of way just because they're so underground. And that might be a good way for us to reach some of those folks. And then I think, and I always say this everywhere that I am, is that, as my mom, didn't even finish 4th grade. And so her writing and reading is very limited, even in her own native language. And I just think that it's really important for us to be super mindful that not everybody knows how to read or write in any language. And so the more visually appealing we can make the communication, the easier, and maybe a good use of video, just kind of talking about what's happening, just a quick little 30-second video that can just go around social media might be helpful in terms of just reaching the masses who may not be able to read or write. I just want to just uplift that. And again, thank you so much for all your hard work. I'm looking forward to working alongside the advocates and Sheila and your team to move this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Sabi George.
Hi, everybody. No, I appreciate the advocates in their testimony because their work obviously is directly on the ground and interacting directly with our residents who aren't always able to access OHS and Katie and Taylor and their team. So appreciate their comments. I don't have any additional questions, but look forward to some of that feedback on some of the questions that were asked today and unable to be answered or in greater detail. So thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Councillor Flynn as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sabi George. Councillor Arroyo. Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I just wanted to also thank the advocates who stayed on, obviously, for some time to thank them for their work and advocacy. Obviously, none of us does this work alone. There are a lot of organizations out there who are providing direct assistance. So wanted to extend my gratitude as well. And to also say I appreciate the candidness of the story, of sharing some of the stories, but most importantly, always coming up with solutions and ideas on how we can do our work even better. And so I just wanted to raise that up. Thank you again, Councillor Edwards, and of course, Councillor Flynn, and thank you to Chief Dillon and her entire team for the work they're doing every day. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. thank you, Katie and Taylor and Dominique, I believe is still on. And I think it was, I put Susanna, who was the IT. I apologize. Tim as well, for being here the entire time and answering all questions. And I know, we know where your hearts are. We know how hard you're working. And thank you for opening your hearts to us to give suggestions and ask these questions about how we can shape this program. It's probably, we're leading, and that's what leadership does. It's okay with adjusting and learning and growing. And I do feel that from all of you. I know how incredibly hard you're working. So I just want to say thank you. We'll continue to just this conversation, and any feedback we get in terms of suggestions, we will certainly forward over to you. We know it will be taken seriously. So thank you so much. With that, I have the water bottle in hand, and this here working session is now over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.